Congressman Jim Himes, thank you for coming tonight, Congressman, who is a Democrat, represents the 4th Congressional District in Connecticut. He is currently in the midst of his second term in office, and he sits on the House Financial Services Committee and the Homeland Security Committees. I'm sure many of you are aware of Jim's compelling personal narrative. He was brought up in a single-parent household by his mother, attended public schools, worked a number of part-time jobs, and was admitted to Harvard University, where he graduated and then was a Rhodes Scholar. And he earned his master's degree from Oxford. He then went on to Goldman Sachs, and I have to get this, then he led the nonprofit Enterprise Community Partners in the Northeast, where he arranged financing and construction of affordable housing units. Jim, the League is very grateful for you being here tonight as our program and for all your support of the League. And please, everyone, welcome, help me welcome Jim Himes. Thank you. So nice to see you.
Thank you. Thank you, Cindy, and let me extend special thanks as well to the League, which so carefully takes thoughtful positions on a lot of issues, but which also encourages a civil dialogue in this country at a time. It's always done that, but of course we've come into a world where our dialogue has gotten a little less civil over time. And so thank you for that, and thank you all for being here. I think the program consists of me making some remarks. I'll try to keep it to 15 minutes or so that we can talk about whatever you'd like to talk about. There's obviously dozens and dozens of pressing issues out there right now. I wanted to just limit my remarks to a couple of areas that are front and center in the news these days, chiefly our fiscal situation and the budget. And then we can talk about anything you like: Libya, Syria, the education policy, energy, and whatnot, all the other big issues. But let me start talking about what we have been experiencing in the press over the course of the last 2 months as we struggled to keep the government open and finish a budget for 2011, which of course is what does this country's fiscal future look like? I may not be alone, but I suspect was somewhat lonely by greeting S&P's negative long-term outlook for U.S. debt 4 days ago. I actually welcomed that because this is a non-political, careful body saying to us, you have got to come together to produce a plan, and really a plan, for long-term stability. And they were very careful about how they said it, and they said some very smart things that you often don't hear in the political give and take. On one side, you tend to hear cut as much as you can, as fast as you can. That's a bad idea. And Simpson Bowles and S&P recognize that. We're in a very fragile recovery, and while we do need to make some cuts and show that we can do that, the timing of those cuts really matters. My side of the aisle, there is a willingness to demagogue any attempt to reform entitlement programs, Medicare, Social Security. And it was good that S&P said, guys, you got to get your act together. And I am actually cautiously optimistic that we will do that. Had the government shut down 2 weeks ago, maybe I wouldn't be quite so optimistic, but there are now enough people coming together around the idea that the federal government needs to restructure its financial commitments that I think it can happen. By the way, it will happen. It will happen. We are on an unsustainable course. And we probably have a year or two at most to come together to produce a plan, or we will be forced to in year 3 or 4 of looking out there now. And the fact is that there's some good activity in the Congress. It's concentrated in the Senate with what's known as the Gang of Six, where you have some very interesting political bedfellows. You've got Dick Durbin, who is on the left side of the Democratic Party, and Tom Coburn, who's on the right side of the Republican together working with other senators to take the Simpson-Bowles proposal. And as I think most of you know, the Simpson-Bowles proposal was the President's Debt Reduction Commission, which identified some cuts to non-defense spending, identified some cuts to defense spending, and then made proposals for reforming Medicare and Social Security that were reasonable. Not easy to talk about. And by the way, none of this stuff is easy to talk about when you become specific. But it was an integrated proposal. I'm one of the few members of the House that is on record as saying he would have voted for that proposal. And it's not that I like it. Nothing in there is fun to talk about, but we do need some kind of comprehensive plan like that if we are going to fix this. So between Congressman Ryan on the Republican side putting forth a proposal, the president having a counter proposal, the Gang of Six working, S&P saying you guys better do this, I actually think that there is a reasonable chance that we will produce a plan. Now, it's not going to be a plan that collectively we like. And, you know, I have to make the point that there are a lot of reasons why the institution I work in has a 17% approval rating right now or something like that. Between Goldman Sachs and Congress, I'm just waiting for that third trifecta of roundly hated institutions. But there's a lot of reasons why the level of anger and emotion is so high right now. And many of those reasons are very good. And of course, chief amongst them is the economic mess that we're in. And the way that the economic mess we're in interacted with the government, because most of America in the last 3 years saw a devastating recession, friends, family, maybe people themselves losing their homes, losing their jobs, and then they saw in September of '08 probably the least politically popular thing you could conceive of, which of course was the Troubled Asset Relief Program, the TARP, the bailout. And what most of America saw was, wait a second, I lost my job, I'm losing my home, and you're taking my taxpayer dollars and you're giving them to these Wall Street institutions that caused this mess in the first place. Now, that's obviously a cartoon, and we live in an area here where a lot of people work for financial institutions, and we understand that it's a good deal more complicated than that, but that's what most of America saw. And so there is an immense amount of emotion out there, and that is emotion, by the way, that worries me a little bit, because what has happened is Congress has its 17% approval ratings. When Jamie Dimon, CEO of JP Morgan Chase, says if you don't raise the debt ceiling, it could be an economic catastrophe, most Americans think the people, the adults that we should perhaps be listening to have been somewhat discredited by where we find ourselves in the last 3 or 4 years. Nonetheless, I do think that we will propose a plan for fiscal sustainability. Now, I represent a lot of you, so you need to know how I think about it. Personally, when it comes to spending cuts, I would criticize Ryan's plan and other plans, frankly, that weren't just Ryan's plans, for leaving defense harmless. We spend $800 billion a year on defense and security in this country. That is more than every other country on the planet combined. So it cannot be held harmless. We need to find and expect cuts there. If for no other reason, then the other bit of the budget that I get to vote on, the non-defense discretionary, is less than that. It's about $500 billion. So you add those two numbers together, which is what I vote on, because the other half of the budget is mandatory spending. You can't exclude anything there. I personally will not be supportive of plans that do one of two things, that do either of two things. One, as we look for cuts, we have to be very, very careful about not cutting those things which are critical to our economic vibrancy. Investment in our infrastructure, and I don't need to tell anybody who lives in Fairfield County how important that is, or the fact that the business associations here identify crumbling infrastructure and housing issues as the single biggest reason why people don't move their businesses here. And I also don't believe, and this is a matter of values, and I suppose somewhat a matter of politics, that we should ask our most vulnerable, our poor, our ill, to bear a lot of the pressure of our fiscal reform. The poorer, the sick, the children didn't benefit from the incredible economic growth that we've seen in this country in the last 30 years. Wages for Americans in the bottom quartile have not moved. And so I think to say to them, guess what, it's the party's over, and we're going to cut the earned income tax credit and Pell Grants that would help you send your kids to college, I just don't think it's right. We are going to need to re-examine the tax code. And I think the way Simpson-Bowles has talked about it is very smart. The proposal brings down our rates and gets rid of a lot of the loopholes that are in there, which has a couple of benefits to it. It simplifies things. It will have, at the corporate level, corporations more focused on doing what they do well rather than playing the tax game. And just as an aside, and we'll talk more about this if you like, as you think about taxes, bear in mind that we are now, as a percent of our GDP, collecting at the federal level the least percentage of taxes as since we have in 1958. So the federal tax burden is lighter now on America than it has been since 1958, when Medicare didn't exist, when we weren't spending $800 billion on defense and security, and when our population was younger. And of course, one of the things driving the challenges that we face is the gradual aging of our population. There's just nothing you do about that, but it is one of the ineluctable facts of where we're going. So, that's where we stand on the budget. An aside on the debt ceiling, because everybody's focused on that now. The Treasury says that we need to raise the debt ceiling by the middle of May. I will tell you that this is a very foolish issue. For some reason, 20 years ago, the Congress decided, or 15 years ago, that they would create a debt ceiling. So rather than vote to raise debt when I vote to increase spending or decrease taxes, both of which I did in my first term, I get to vote to do those things, to increase spending or decrease taxes, and then I get to turn around and vote against raising the debt ceiling, which is illogical and hypocritical. This is not something that is serious unless we screw around with it. Because unlike shutting down the government, which would be an inconvenience and would have, we've been there before, national parks would shut down, museums would shut down, Social Security checks might be delayed. If we hold the debt ceiling hostage to whatever policy initiative you want to use, we are messing around with the full faith and credit of the United States government. If we do not raise the debt ceiling, there will come a moment when we do not service our debt. And that is a very, very serious proposition. So there's all kinds of talk out there. Are you going to raise the debt ceiling? Yes, we're going to raise the debt ceiling. That doesn't mean we shouldn't do the hard work of figuring out how to balance our budget and get ourselves on a fiscal path. But we are going to raise the debt ceiling. And hopefully we're going to do it without a lot of shenanigans. The metaphor I draw, given the seriousness of a belief that we're not going to pay our debts, is, I would never say, I'm not going to agree to fund the protection of our nuclear weapons unless you support Planned Parenthood. You just don't mess around with stuff that serious. And so I hope that we get past that pretty quickly. Last point, and I touched on this before. We face these difficulties at a time when we are paying the price for underinvestment in physical infrastructure. The American Society of Engineers says that to bring our infrastructure up to snuff from whatever they rated it, B- or something, or C+, to reasonable, comes with a $2 to $3 trillion price tag. And this is something we can't not do. If we neglect to do that, eventually it will have a real impact on our economy. We face very serious issues around the funding of education. We're very fortunate, those of us who live in Greenwich, to have a terrific system of education, but go up the road to Stanford or Norwalk and Bridgeport, and you see that those are systems, particularly in Bridgeport, that are failing very, very badly. And if we expect to be competitive and innovative, we will fix that. And I wish I could tell you that fixing that was going to be free, but it's not. So we are in a real vice here, where we've got to do what some very difficult things around getting ourselves sustainable at a time when we're going to be called on to invest in those things which are really critical to the future vigor of our economy. I want to touch on one last topic before we open it up, and that is energy. It's a very difficult topic for a guy like me to get asked about, because a lot of times when I get asked questions, the expectation is that I have an answer. Energy is a tough one, and we are living the legacy of whatever it's been, 40 years of not having a strategy to release ourselves from being hostage to the global oil markets. And yes, on the margin, in the short term, financial players, speculators can have an impact on the price. But that's not what's going on here fundamentally. Fundamentally, what is going on is that there's 1.5 billion people in China, many of whom are becoming middle class and are interested in owning cars. There's 1 billion people in India, many of whom are becoming middle class. And these two countries, collectively half of the world's population, are growing very rapidly and starting to become middle class, with all that implies for use of commodities and use of energy. And of course, you put on top of that instability in the world's oil-producing regions, and you have $4.30 at the pump. The point of saying all that is that we have neglected for decades to be serious about an energy policy which weans us from that. Jimmy Carter famously said that this was critical that we do it. And the question is, when are we going to do it? We took a crack at it with the American Clean Energy and Security Act in the last Congress. It did not make it through the Senate. It was a carefully calibrated bill to try to get us moving towards sustainables, but it didn't get through the Senate. It's a tough problem because it's not just partisan. It's not Republicans versus Democrats. It's Connecticut versus West Virginia. We don't mine a lot of coal in Connecticut, but West Virginia's economy relies on mining coal. It, like the economic debate, is a debate where nothing is easy. You know, I have always been pro-careful nuclear. That's a pretty tough thing to be right now in the face of the Fukushima disaster. But as I remind people, okay, if there's no nuclear, let's consider how hostage we are to Middle Eastern petroleum with what that involves, and how much of our military and security is committed to that. And by the way, we've got spectacular gas reserves in the Marcellus Shale region of New York and Pennsylvania, but that too, to extract is environmentally questionable. All this stuff comes with liabilities and negative things associated with it. And so now is the time, and frankly 30 years ago was the time to begin to put together a strategy to take control over our future, over our energy futures. So that's one on which I don't have a good answer for you, beyond which we, just as we need to come together on the financial side, on the fiscal side, to take some hard decisions, we need to do that in the energy world as well. Even if you don't believe in climate change, which I hope you do, you know, even if you, all right, somebody doesn't believe in climate change, but even if you don't believe in climate change, be concerned about the fact that after leading the IT revolution in this country, and all the names, the IBMs, the Microsofts, the Googles, all of the names that created so much wealth and employment in the United States of America, we are not going to lead the next wave of innovation if we don't act soon. Photovoltaics on this planet are being produced in Shanghai at a far higher rate than they're being produced here. So even if you don't believe all the other stuff and you're not an environmentalist, whatever, you should really worry about the fact that for the first time, the United States of America is not going to lead a technological revolution. Last thing I'm going to say, and then I'll open it up. I want to step back a second here and tell you something that's going to surprise you. I've now been down there for, I guess, 28 months, and it's probably been the toughest couple of years to be in Congress in a very long time because of the emotion that I talked about before. Some of you attended healthcare town hall meetings. I attended all my own healthcare town meetings. I've got the gray hairs to prove it. Obviously, very controversial issues, very tough times. I will tell you that I come out of the back end of those 27 months actually pretty confident about the resilience and the capability of our system. And yes, I have colleagues who are probably past their sell-by date, and yes, I have colleagues who are, you know, some who are there for the wrong reasons. But by and large, the people that I work with down there work hard to represent their constituents and do a lot of this. And we'll get to the listening part, but do a lot of listening to their constituents and try to do the right thing. And that may sound odd in the context of an institution that has such low approval ratings. But you know, as I watch what's happening in the Middle East, you get back to that classic line: democracy is a terrible system, or the worst system, except for all the rest. It actually works pretty well. I have two concerns, and I talked about some of the emotional reasons that are unique to our moment in time: a terrible recession, the TARP, all that stuff. Fundamentally, guiding the budget debate is this political problem, which is, and we'll all sort of recognize this,